Today from John chapter 1, the first 5 verses and then verse 14. John writes, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, but the darkness has not understood it. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." Word of the Lord. Brothers and sisters in Christ, if you were to compare the first couple chapters of all 4 Gospels, here's what you'd find. In Matthew, you'd find a genealogy of Jesus, followed by a narrative of his birth, kind of told from Joseph's perspective. In Mark, you might be surprised to find nothing about Jesus' birth. Mark jumps right into John the Baptist's ministry and Jesus' ministry. Luke has the most extensive recording of Jesus' birth. That's why we read that one every Christmas Eve. And even more than that, in chapter 1 of Luke, you'll find also the annunciation of John the Baptist's birth, of Jesus' birth. It'll have Zechariah's song and Mary's song in there. But then you get to the book of John. Now, the book of John is different from the other 3 Gospels in a lot of ways, but especially in the beginning here. You won't find a narrative like you'll find in Matthew and Luke. He doesn't just skip it like Mark does. But in John, he talks about the theological significance of Christmas, of the incarnation. And he's got a really good reason for doing that. You see, John was the last gospel writer to write his gospel. He's writing it towards the end of the 1st century AD. And so John has a unique opportunity here because by that time in history, false teachings about who Jesus was had started to come out. And so John could write his gospel and at the same time address specifically some of these false teachings. And one of the guys that he is speaking against, especially right here at the beginning, is a man named Cerinthus. Now, Cerinthus was a guy who taught that Jesus was not there in the beginning. He was not with the Father. He was not God, and therefore he didn't take part in any of creation. He denied the Trinity, and he used a passage in Deuteronomy to try to make his point. It was a misinterpretation of that passage. And so John starts his gospel by addressing that. And he does it with amazing style, too. If you were to hold up Genesis chapter 1 and John chapter 1 and kind of put them side by side, you're going to see a lot of similarities in how John starts the gospel here. And you may remember Genesis was written by Moses, right? So he's using Mosaic style to refute a man who claims to derive his false teaching from Moses. Yeah, pretty cool. And so he starts by saying, this is who Jesus is. He was there in the beginning. He was with the Father. He was and is God. He says that all in verse 1. So much packed into that first verse. And then he elaborates a little bit. Verse 3 says that everything that was created by Jesus. He took part in creation. In fact, nothing that has been created was created without him. What John is saying is that this word, Jesus, was there in the beginning. He took part in creation. He is the full divinity of God. He is just as much God as God the Father. He is just as much God as God the Spirit. That little child that lay in the manger, that baby born to Mary, that's God. God's Son. Although he looks humble, although he looks weak, that is God in the flesh. That's the mystery of Christmas, the mystery of the incarnation. What John so succinctly says in verse 14, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." Could Mary and Joseph have known who they were looking at? Well, they maybe knew better than some people because they had been told by the angel who they were looking at. But could they fully grasp what they were looking at here? Could the shepherds? Well, they too, they received an appearance of an angel and were told who this child was. But even they, as they looked on this child, who looked humble and meek, could they know that that's the full divinity of God in that child there? This is Emmanuel. This is God with us. God has come to be with his people. The extent of what that means was perhaps beyond the grasp of Mary and Joseph and the shepherds. It's beyond the grasp of us sometimes. It's a lifelong practice trying to wrap our heads around what happened there on that Christmas. It's an amazing theological exercise. It's something that even some of the deepest theologians are still digging into. But it's more than just an intellectual classroom type exercise. It's an exercise that brings us amazing comfort to think about who this child in the manger was. So we're going to dig into that comfort a bit. And it comes from, we're going to start by digging out a detail from verse 14, which we've already read twice. But here it is again, the beginning part of it. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. Now, a really literal way to say dwelling is the Word became flesh and tented among us. He tented, like set up a tent among us. Now, John is very intentional in his word choice here because he wants you to remember all of the other times that God had come to tent with his people. So now you're racking your brains, right? You're trying to think, when's the last time I heard about a tent in the Bible? You got to go all the way back to the time of Moses. After Moses had led the Israelites out of Egypt and they were out in the wilderness, God had given the Israelites a specific way to worship, and the building in which they were to worship was the tabernacle, which was quite literally just a tent. It was a portable worship space. But God attached certain promises to this tent, to this tabernacle. Exodus 40 says that the glory of the Lord filled this tent. God was present with his people in that tabernacle, and the Israelites saw visible evidence of this as the cloud, the pillar of smoke and fire was above this tabernacle day and night. God was present with his people. That's how God was present with his people throughout history. And then you fast forward a bit to the time of King Solomon, when King Solomon built for the Lord a permanent structure, no longer a tent, but a permanent temple, this beautiful temple. And at the end of the building process, when it was all complete, we get this passage in 2 Chronicles that says, when Solomon finished praying, fire came down from heaven and consumed the burnt offerings and sacrifices, and the glory of the Lord filled the temple. God was present with his people. The glory of the Lord was with his people, and it was an amazing thing. Yet one thing you'll learn, as you learn a little bit more about the tabernacle and the temple, is that there was always a separation. It was great that God came to be with his people, but it was as if people could get close, but not too close. They could get close to the presence of God, but if they got too close to this glory of the Lord, they would die. Here's an example of this. Once a year, the high priest was to go into the presence of the Lord, which was specifically in the Ark of the Covenant. And this Ark of the Covenant was set in this special room called the Most Holy Place. This was a part of the tabernacle. This was a part of the temple. And this Most Holy Place where the Ark of the Covenant was separated by a curtain or a wall. And nobody else could be in there. Nobody else could see it. And only the high priest could go in there once a year. And he had specific instructions on what he was supposed to do when he was in there. Well, Jewish tradition records for us that when the high priest would go in there, his one time a year, the people would tie a rope around his ankle just in case he died in the presence of the Lord, so that nobody else would have to go into the presence of the Lord to get him out of there. Which kind of tells you that either somebody had died in the presence of the Lord, or that they were just they were making that possibility or thinking about that possibility there. Because coming into the presence of God, being in front of the glory of the Lord, was an awesome and scary thing. Because there was always a separation that existed between God and sinners. It was sin that created that separation in the first place, that created this chasm between us and God that made us hostile to God. And so there was always a separation between the holy God and sinful people. There was always a separation between the glory of God and sinful people until the glory of God showed up in a different way. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. One of the things that you'll find, I think for the last few years, on the list of the top generous, the most generous celebrities out there, you'll find names like Ellen and Jay-Z and Beyonce and Taylor Swift, and they're just measuring dollars-wise here, but they're consistently some of the most generous givers to different charitable causes. Now, you can make the case that they probably have a lot to give, right? But I'm willing to bet that after they're done with their giving, they probably still go home and they sleep in their mansions and they drive their cars and they have all of the accommodations that they had before. Their life is not impacted all that much by even this extravagant giving that they do. And the same is true for us too, right? You might be very generous, yet I'm still willing to bet that even after you're done giving, you have a place to go sleep, you have a mode of transportation. Your life is not impacted in a drastic, dramatic kind of way. Have you ever imagined giving in such a dramatic way that you're giving of everything? You're getting rid of all of your things. You're getting rid of all of your money. You're getting rid of all of it. You ever entertained that thought? I'm guessing if you have, it's only just kind of been an imagination kind of thing. You've never seriously thought about getting rid of everything. And I'm not encouraging you to, but that's what Jesus did. When Jesus, who is fully God, who created the world, when he became man, he set aside the use of his divine power. This God who created the universe humbled himself to become dependent on two poor newlyweds from Nazareth. He had to have his diaper changed. He had to be carried places. He had to be fed and taught how to feed himself. This is the world-creating God who's humbling himself in that way. That's no small thing, that the Son of God would set aside the use of his divinity to become like us. But he became like us so that he could remove the separation between us and God, so that the glory of the Lord would show up in this humble child, and he would reconcile sinners to God. He would bring sinners and God back together again. And he did. Because what started in the humility of the manger would end in humiliation on the cross. As he would bow his head, give up his spirit, and that curtain of separation that separated the people from the presence of God, that most holy place, you know what happened when Jesus died? He bowed his head, gave up his spirit, and that curtain of separation tore in two because there was no more separation between God and man because of what Jesus had done. He had brought them back together again. Do you remember the account of Jesus' transfiguration? Jesus is on top of this mountain with his inner circle of disciples, Peter, James, and John. And all of a sudden, in front of their eyes, he is transfigured. He is transformed. And the disciples, for the first time in Jesus' ministry, get to see the full glory that Jesus had. He let them see his full divinity for just a little bit. And to his left and to his right were Moses and Elijah, showing that Jesus was the fulfillment of the law and the prophets. Do you remember how Peter reacted to this? Peter was so happy and excited to be in the presence of the glory of God, to see this amazing sight, that he wanted to set up tents for Moses and Elijah and Jesus to stay, and he'd even be willing to use a rock as a pillow if they would just stay there a little bit longer, if he could prolong that moment being in the presence of God just a little bit longer. There will come a time when being in the presence of the glory of the Lord won't just last a moment. God came to tent among his people so that we will tent with him forever in heaven. You know, it's really interesting that John uses the word that he does in John 1:14, because he uses the same exact word later when he writes the book of Revelation. At the very end of the book of Revelation, in Revelation chapter 20, when John is talking about the new heaven and the new earth, where believers are going to go when they die, he says this. He says, I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, look, God's dwelling, his tenting place, is now among his people, and he will dwell, he will tent with them. They will be his people, and God himself will be with them and be their God. Man, we look forward to that day, don't we? Yet God has promised to be present right here and right now, too. And so we set up our tents in where God has promised to be present. Wherever 2 or 3 come together in his name, he says, there he is with them. He is with us right now, right here. And so we set up our tent in worship in the Word. We come to worship and hear the Word often. We spend time in the Word on our own because God has promised to be present with us there and communicate with us there. God has also promised his presence in a special way as he comes to us in body and blood in the sacrament. And so we set up our tent in that sacrament and we partake of it as often as we can. Who knew so much would come of this little child? Who knew we could have so many applications that could come from just this simple verse? A verse that has such great theological depth, but a verse that brings us great comfort. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us.